Iron bars gleamed in Bitter Spring Square, caging a woman under Wyoming's merciless sun, 1876. Hannah Tate knelt on baked earth, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her bruised wrists pressed to parched planks. Dust clung to her tears. Around the square, plank porches sagged beneath boots and murmured judgment. Caleb Ward's wagon creaked to a halt, canvas flapping like a tattered prayer, his storm-gray eyes meeting Hannah's hollow gaze in the dusty hush. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. Caleb's daughters, Lila and Rose, leaned from the seat. Lila, 10, her curls bound by a faded ribbon, watched the cage with wide-eyed sorrow. Rose, 8, clutched a rag doll and hissed, "Pa, why is she locked up?" The children's whispered questions stirred knots in Caleb's chest, reminders of his late wife's final breath 2 years past. He lifted his hat and draped his coat across the girl's shoulders. "Stay close," he murmured, voice low as sagebrush. He gathered reins in one hand, Colt in the other, and stepped into the square. Hannah lifted her head. Her dress, once white, was torn and stained by creek mud and cruel neglect. A silver locket hung at her throat, a dove etched in mother's hand. She met Caleb's gaze, grief and defiance flickering like embers. He knelt before the bars, careful of splintered wood beneath his boots. "What's your name?" he asked, voice barely above dust whisper. Hannah raised trembling fingers. "Hannah Tate," she said, tone as brittle as winter ice. She bowed her head, shawl slipping to reveal bruises blooming purple and gold across her forearms. Her infertility had become her sin. Her ex-husband, Ezra Kane, had declared her unclaimed, no duty, no worth, then handed her to the town's harsh customs. Caleb's jaw tightened. He remembered his wife's laughter among pine-scented air, her gentle hands on their daughter's cheeks. Now grief's shadow drove him to defiance. He rose, shouldering his hat. He turned to the nearest storefront, Silas Boone's general store, boards groaning under his stride. Inside, Silas polished a counter scarred by days of trade, his apron dust-streaked. He looked up with placid disdain. "She ain't livestock," Caleb said, voice firm as canyon rock. "Why is she caged?" Silas's smile was thin as rattlesnake's coil. "Town rules, Mr. Ward. Infertile women are unclaimed, warnings to wives and daughters." Ezra Kane insisted, "I merely enforce what's written." He tapped a ledger bound in oiled hide. "No woman without children may claim land or honor." Caleb's heart ached at Silas's words. He recalled his wife's failing body, the life he'd lost, the promise to protect his girls. He placed a hand on Silas's ledger. "This isn't justice." Silas shrugged. "This is order. You're free to speak, Mr. Ward, but the cage stays." Outside, Lila pressed her palm to bars. "She's thirsty," the girl said, voice small but fierce. Rose unrolled a cloth and produced a tin cup. Caleb lifted the cage's latch and let the girls press water through the bars. Hannah's fingers closed around the cup. Simple trust beneath cruel iron. Silas cleared his throat as the water dripped across dusty planks. "End of mercy," he said. Caleb turned from Silas and knelt beside Hannah. He draped his late wife's shawl, a shawl of wool woven in twilight hues, over the cage's bars. The fabric hung like dawn across her shoulders. Hannah's breath caught as she touched the wool's softness. He met her eyes. "You're free tonight," he vowed. That evening, Bitter Springs fell to pink and amber sky. Caleb backed his wagon from town, laden with blankets and pemmican. Lila and Rose perched atop crates of oats, curiosity blazing in her eyes. Hannah sat on a coil of rope, wrists unbound but spirit still wary. She held the shawl at her breast, its colors a memory of home she no longer had. They passed scrub oaks and sun-scorched sage until the valley opened to a hidden meadow. Pines rimmed the clearing, tall guardians against prying eyes. Under starlit dusk, Caleb built a small fire, its glow flaring like hope against black branches. Hannah knelt beside him, pressing the shawl to her face as flames licked the sky. Lila set bowls of stew on a flat stone. "You hungry?" she asked, voice gentle as summer rain. Hannah nodded, lifting the bowl. She tasted the broth, salt pork, wild onions, turnip, each spoonful a balm for more than hunger. Rose brought her doll forward, placing it on Hannah's knee. The gesture spoke of trust deeper than words. Amos Reed, trapper and neighbor, emerged from pine-shadowed dusk with a blacksmith's crowbar. He laid a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "She's safe here, but Cain won't rest." His voice rattled like distant thunder. He nodded at the meadow's rim. Ezra's rider's lantern bobbed on the ridge. "They'll follow." Hannah pressed a shawl across her heart. She reached into her hair and produced a carved hairpin. Oak would etch with her mother's initials. She held it out. Caleb accepted the pin, placing it in his coat pocket, a silent pledge to safeguard her past. Above them, the Milky Way spilled like sacred fire. The meadow's hush deepened, broken only by crackling embers and children's whispers. Lila rolled the shawl into a pillow for Hannah. Rose tucked in blankets around her knees. Caleb settled beside the fire, Colt across his lap, eyes fixed on distant pines where pursuit's promise flickered in lantern glow. In that fragile stillness, Hannah met Caleb's gaze, gratitude and fear bound in each breath. He nodded once, voiceless vow. Tomorrow they'd face the town's judgment, but tonight she would taste freedom beneath Wyoming's endless sky. A horn's distant wail cut the meadow's hush, a rider's signal crossing wind-swept ridges. Hannah's eyes widened. Lila clutched her father's sleeve. Amos raised his hand in warning as the campfire's gold rings trembled against the dark. The valley held its breath for the storm, and the final reckoning that dawn would bring. A rider's lantern pierced the meadow's dusk, chasing Caleb Ward's fragile camp under Wyoming's starlit sky. 1876. Shadows lengthened across frost-kissed grass as hoofbeats thudded in the distance. Ezra Cain's pursuit drawing near. Caleb pressed his daughters close to the fire's edge. Hannah Tate, draped in his late wife's shawl, pressed a dove-etched locket to her chest. The wind whispered through pine boughs. Freedom was borrowed, and debt would demand its due. The sheriff and his deputy emerged at camp's rim, boots sloshing through dew-frozen grass. Sheriff Leary's lantern swung low, lantern light trembling across his iron star. "Caleb Ward," he called, voice thick with duty's weight. "Town law demands Hannah Tate's return." His deputy reined a horse beside him, eyes hard beneath furrowed brows. Caleb rose, shoulders squared. Lila and Rose clung to his coat hems. "She ain't yours to claim," Caleb said softly. His voice carried a promise of defiance. "She's free." He lifted the shawl, revealing Hannah's pale form. The sheriff's jaw tightened. The deputy's hand hovered above a Colt. Hannah pressed a hand to her bruised wrist, shawl's fringe falling away. She met the sheriff's gaze. Hollow grief transformed into quiet resolve. "I'm free," she said, voice steady as canyon wind. "Ezra's law bound me, not God's or man's." The deputy's Colt dropped by a heartbeat. The sheriff's gaze flickered, doubt surfacing beneath duty's veneer. Lila swallowed and stepped forward. "She's kind," the girl said, voice small but clear. She offered a tin cup of water. Rose placed her doll beside Hannah's knee. The sheriff looked from daughters' earnest faces to Hannah's trembling smile. The deputy exhaled, spurs clicking in resignation. "This matter's above my pay grade," he muttered. The sheriff nodded once and lifted his lantern. "We leave at dawn." They faded down the trail, law tempered by compassion. That night, rain began as a whisper against canvas, light taps growing to rush drumming on canvas wagons and tent flaps. Amos Reed, trapper and Caleb's old friend, braced the wagon's oilcloth cover. "Storm's on us," he warned. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rumbled like distant hooves. Caleb gathered his daughters close and lifted Hannah to her feet. Rain tangled in her hair. The shawl clung to her shoulders, truss woven in wool. By lantern light, they broke camp and piled blankets into crates. Lila swept embers toward ashes. Rose tied Hannah's locket to the shawl's fringe, binding her to warmth. Rain stung their cheeks. Pine branches drooped with icy weight. Hannah's fingers trembled as she lashed crates to the wagon. Each knot was a prayer for safety. Each soaked blanket a promise against the cold. The drive to Elk Ridge was slow and treacherous. Mud clung to wagon wheels. Horses labored uphill through wind-whipped pines. Caleb held the reins with fingers stiff as winter's breath. Hannah sat beside him, shawl wrapped tight, hairpin glinting beneath her bonnet, oak carving faint against sweat-darkened metal. She stared through rain-streaked windows at shadowed ridges, heart racing with each tree's silhouette. Amos followed in Trapper's buckboard, rifle across one knee. He steered through gully tracks, guiding them to a cabin hewn of fir logs and moss. Home base, he called over gusting wind. The cabin's chimney smoked thinly. A lantern glowed through frosted panes. Inside, log walls radiated firelight. Bundles of dried herbs and pemmican hung from ceiling beams. It smelled of hearth and refuge. Hannah, stepped inside and brushed rain from her shawl. She sank to a bench beside the hearth, toes warming against split pine boards. Lila and Rose pressed mirrors of concern in her eyes. Hannah held out trembling hands and produced a needle and thread from her sleeve, mother skill passed down in silent heritage. She began to mend Rose's doll dress, each stitch binding her past to this new life. The girls watched in rapt silence, hope slipping between rainbowed steam. Caleb fetched stew from Amos's kettle, salt pork, wild onions, and turnip, laden in wooden bowls. He offered one to Hannah. She accepted with a nod and closed her eyes between bites as comfort seeped into sore limbs. Each mouthful was a step toward healing. Each spoonful a taste of trust shared. Amos settled beside the door, rifle at port. Ezra Kane's not just a husband scorned. He's after Vale's hidden claim. He tapped the hairpin's carving, oak initials half-worn. That locket holds a real deed. Her family's land extends beyond Bitter Springs. Kane wants that inheritance clear of Vale heirs. His voice was gravel-soft. Rain rattled the cabin's roof as thunder moaned beyond. Hannah's eyes flicked to the locket and hairpin. She pressed the shawl's fringe against her cheek, memory flaring of father's ledger and mother's gentle hands. She nodded once, resolve rising like dawn beyond storm's clouds. Caleb bowed his head, grief and hope tangled in his chest. He placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder. Silent vowed to shield her from greedy hands. Before dawn broke, a knock echoed through damp logs. Caleb rose, heart clenching. Hannah tensed, shawl falling to reveal bruised wrists. Amos lifted lantern. Its glow caught fresh impressions in the wooden door. Deep hoof prints and boot scars. Outside, rain burned into mud, each drop erasing tracks. The knock came again, stern, final. Caleb opened to find a rider in sodden coat, face hidden beneath a drenched hat. The man handed him a folded letter seal with Ezra Kane's crest. Caleb's fingers trembled as he cut the seal, cursive looping threats of legal action. Pardon demanded by Bitter Springs magistrate at sundown. The rider's lamplight swung once, then vanished into gleaming rut. Hannah drew a shuddering breath. Lila and Rose pressed close, eyes wide at the letter's folded edges. Caleb exhaled, rainwater dripping from his brim. "They'll come again," he murmured. He returned inside, closing the door against wind's howl. The cabin's hearth glowed steady as rain lashed walls. Hannah folded the letter, nodding courage into her gaze. She handed the hairpin to Caleb, oak initials facing him. He slipped it into his coat. Amos exhaled, candlelight dancing in his steel gaze. "Dawn brings court again," he said, "and one final reckoning." In the hush before storm's end, the little family drew close. Shawl and hairpin bound them. Sweat and tears carved silent trust. Outside, rain pounded pine branches, lament for lost past, promise for tomorrow's struggle. The valley held its breath, waiting for first light to spill truth across Elk Ridge's slope. Dust cloaked Elk Ridge's cabin, where Caleb Ward guarded his fragile family, unaware of Ezra Kane's shadowed ambush, 1876. Hannah Tate sat by the hearth, weaving Lila's curls into neat braids. Each loop of hair was a stitch in trust. Each fingers glided him of healing. Rose clutched a rag doll as Hannah hummed a lullaby her mother sang, soft as pine needles stirring in breeze. Outside, pine-scented dust pressed against log walls, the world's hush belying the danger gathering beyond. Caleb moved from window to window, fitting boards across shutters with Amos Reed's help. The trapper's lantern swung on a nail, rifle rested within reach. Caleb's scarred hands worked with methodical care. Nails sunk deep, boards shimmed tight, his grief chisel focus honed by a vow to protect. Memories of his wife's final winter whispered in each pulse, promised to shield his daughters from cold and cruelty. The girls played atop of fur pelts, Lila tracing with grain on the floor, Rose stacking firewood from Mama's stove. Hannah guided their small hands, shawl's fringe brushing the hearth's glow. She pressed the shawl around Rose's shoulders, wordless blessing in wool's warmth. Rose smiled, head bobbing, trust woven in each fold. At last light, hoofbeats thundered across the ridge. Amos peered from the door's crack. "Men on the move, Ezra's pack," he murmured. Caleb's jaw clenched. He nodded once. Outside, wind scoured sagebrush, carrying a hollow note, Ezra's warning horn. The door burst inward. 3 riders, faces masked by scars, poured into the cabin's amber light. Rose shrieked. Hannah leapt forward, shawl flung wide. Caleb's colt barked once, splintered floorboards, but the riders advanced. One seized Rose, cloak swirling as he lifted her like a rag doll. She kicked and cried, "Mama," as hooded rider carried her into moonlit shadows. "Not anymore," Caleb shouted, voice thick as canyon mud. He raised Amos's rifle. Amos charged with shotgun's roar. Hannah raced outside, shawl's fringe a banner against night. The men vanished over the ridge, Rose's sob echoing in the pines. Caleb stumbled to the crest, hand on the rail of his colt. "Rose!" he called, voice swallowed by Canyon's maw. Amos hoisted Hannah onto his shoulder. "Bring her," he said, leading them down a narrow deer trail. The ridge's shadows clung to stone. Moonlight gleamed on sheer walls. Each footprint pressed danger's promise into the soft earth. Hannah pressed against Amos, shawl pulling at her knees. She fingered the hairpin at her throat, oak carved with her mother's initials, faint as pulse beat. The pin's weight tethered her to home. Its initials pointed Caleb's gaze to a rocky outcrop ahead, landmark matching the deed fragment hidden within her locket. They crept along ledges slick with moss and night's dew. Lila and Rose stumbled free, racing into their father's arms. Amos set them on level ground. Caleb gathered Rose close, tears and moonlight mixing on her cheeks. "You're safe?" he whispered, pressing the shawl around her. Rose buried her face in its folds. The riders paused by a hollow undercut, a cave mouth faint as a wound. Lantern light spilled across rough walls. Ezra's men clustered around a canvas satchel, its leather straps looped with Hannah's shawl and hairpin pinned to the flap. They rifled through camp spoils, laughing at their prize. Rose whimpered under one rider's arm. Lila clung to Amos's boot. Caleb raised his colt, voice echoing off stone. "Let them go." His figure trembled in strength and fury. The men turned, surprise flickering behind scarred masks. Amos stepped from the dark, shotgun leveled. "No harm to the children," he said. Hannah advanced, locket glinting on her breast. She produced a deeds fragment, folded map showing Vale family boundaries' true corner at this very cave. The riders paused as she unhooked the hairpin and pressed it against cross lines on the fragment. "My inheritance," she said, voice clear as canyon air. "Ezra Kane's claim ends here." One rider spat into the dirt. "Your claim's worthless. Ezra's law holds weight in Bitter Springs." He brandished a Winchester. Lila shrank behind Amos's leg. Caleb advanced, colt steady. "Not here." He fired a warning shot into low ceiling. Stone chips spattered dust. Amos fired birdshot overhead. Echoes rattled off walls. The riders dropped their rifles and backed toward the cave mouth. When last rider slipped into moon shadows, Caleb lowered his colt and gathered Rose. Hannah knelt to the children's height and braided Lila's curls around the hairpin. looping family's legacy into her braid. She pressed the oak initials to Lila's palm. "We keep her safe," Hannah said, her voice tender as dawn's first light. Lila nodded, eyes bright with quiet courage. Caleb slung his Colt and placed a hairpin in Hannah's hand. "Promise me," he said. Her nod spoke trust deeper than any oath. Amos guided them back a long ridge trail. Pines whispered under stars. Canyon walls held their secret vigil. At the cabin door, Caleb pressed his daughters inside and lifted Hannah to the hearth's glow. He draped the shawl around her shoulders once more, each fold a testament to shared refuge. By lantern light, Hannah unfolded Ezra's letter, the one they found pinned to her shawl. She read his neat script. Threats of legal action, warning that Bitter Springs magistrate had new orders. At bottom, another line. A friend in town stands ready to see justice done. Her breath caught. She traced the anonymous signature, milkweed flourish hinting at Silas Boone's hand. Caleb's gaze flicked to the letter. Amos tapped the table, rifle resting on its side. Ezra's ally, Amos said softly, eyes dark. Silas's ledger bears more than store records. Hannah folded the letter with trembling fingers and placed it within her locket shell. She pressed it closed, heart pounding in each beat of silver. Caleb exhaled, grief and hope entwined in his chest. He drew Hannah into his arms. She rested her head on his shoulder as firelight danced on pine-scented logs. In that fragile calm, the world held its breath. Dawn would bring a town's reckoning in one final trial, justice's final measure at Bitter Springs threshold. At the cabin's corner, oilcloth rustled. Lila peered out to see a figure slip into shadow. Silas Boone, ledger underarm, hat low. His lantern winked once before vanishing into the pines. The valley waited for sun's promise to break betrayal's night. Bitter Springs Square pulsed with judgment, where Hannah Tate faced a betrayer under Wyoming's dust-choked sky. 1876. Caleb Ward stood at her side, shawl draped across both their shoulders, a single shelter against scorn and sun. Townsfolk gathered on plank porches, creaking beneath boots. Lanterns flickered on porch posts, and heat haze rippled over iron bars where Silas Boone waited to defend Ezra Kane's forged claims. Dawn found Caleb and Hannah on the edge of the square, preparing for the hearing in Silas's general store turned makeshift courtroom. Amos Reed leaned against the wagon's wheel, rifle slung low, eyeing dusty ledgers piled on a counter. Lila and Rose pressed close to their father, Rose tracing the oak initials on Hannah's hairpin. Caleb smoothed the shawl's folds across Hannah's shoulders, pulling its wool warm tight. "We stand together," he murmured, voice steady as canyon stone. Hannah nodded, hand curling around his gloved thumb. The children watched, wide-eyed, faith stitched in their silence. Inside, benches lined the walls. A long plank served as jury's bench. Magistrate Harlan Burke sat beneath a wagon wheel chandelier, ledger open on his desk. Silas Boone perched to one side, fingers drumming the ledger's corner. The townsfolk's murmur grew as Burke tapped his gavel. "We hear Hannah Tate's claim against Silas Boone's ledger entries," he intoned. The store's tar paper roof strained under wind's first gust, dust swirling in shafts of morning light. Amos rose first, lantern in hand, and stepped forward. "I witnessed Silas alter the ledger," he declared, voice crackling like prairie fire. He laid Ezra Kane's letter beside the ledger, sealed in oilcloth, its folds stained with mud and threats. He delivered Ezra's forged contracts, then asked me to certify them as trade records. I refused. Amos's gaze encompassed every face. Neighbor, blacksmith, saloon keeper. I stand with truth. Silas's jaw clenched. He leaned toward Burke. "Lies, Reed." His voice was thin as wind through pines. "I merely registered transactions." He tapped the ledger's margins. Ezra's claim was legal, signed on witness mark. Kane sought no deceit. His stare cut toward Hannah, daring her to speak. Caleb rose, mounting the bench beside Hannah. He laid a hand on her shawl-wrapped shoulder. "My daughters know no greater cruelty than law used to punish the innocent." He met Silas's gaze. "She's free of Ezra's debt. Her father's deed extends beyond Bitter Springs, and Silas's entries painted over her inheritance. His colt lay on the bench, a silent threat against injustice. Her claim stands. A hush fell. Lila and Rose stepped forward. Lila held out the hairpin, its oak initials gleaming. "This belongs to her family," Lila said, voice pure as creek water. She pressed the pin into Hannah's hand. Rose offered the shawl's fringe. Hannah wrapped around Lila's neck, bond reknit in wool's grace. Silence spoke of choices made, bonds unbroken. Burke studied the hairpin and fragment of deed. He turned to Silas. "Any rebuttal?" Silas's face paled, ledger trembling in his grasp. He stammered, then lowered his head. The murmurs grew, neighbors shifting from dread to determination. Burke rapped his gavel. "Silas Boone, your entries are void, and you forfeit any claim derived therefrom. You must leave Bitter Springs by tomorrow's sun, or face contempt of court." Silas rose, spurs clicking on planks. He stared at Hannah, then Caleb, then the faces on the benches. He spat into the sawdust. "You'll rue this," he snarled, voice brittle. He stalked out, clutching ledger and oilcloth, his steps echoing betrayal across plank porches. Outside, wind flicked dust into swirling eddies. Caleb guided Hannah and the girls into mercantile shade, where Amos joined them, rifle at rest. Lila leaned against Hannah, whispering, "We did it." Rose hugged Caleb's knee, trust sealed in action and vow. Caleb draped the shawl across Hannah's shoulders. She pressed her cheek to his arm, answering his vow without words. "We're family." They loaded the wagon for return to Elk Ridge. Oak crates filled with blankets and provisions, the locket's fragments secured beneath Caleb's coat. A dust storm swirled around the square's edge, gusting through Main Street's horizon. Loose scrolls of Silas's trilater, notices whipped past boots, scrawling faded ink in the wind. Amos lashed oilcloth over the wagon's canvas. Caleb lifted the girls to their perch atop hay bales. Hannah seated beside him, shawl draped like dawn. The storm hit as they crested a ridge. Plumes of ochre haze billowed against wagon wheels. Visibility shrank to mere paces. Wind howled through spokes. Horses strained uphill, hoofs churning sand into clouds. Caleb guided them by memory, lean hand on Hannah's shoulder. She reached for the hairpin at her throat, its initials pressed against her heart. Each knot in the shawl's fringe flapped like prayer flags. Amos rode close in the buckboard, rifle across his lap. He pointed to a wash where gullied trails converged. "Take the hollow," he shouted against wind's roar. The wagon rattled into a narrow canyon, walls flaring red in dust's glow. Pines loomed overhead. Their boughs snapped in protest. The cabin's chimney appeared, smoke curling like faith. Inside, log walls glowed with hearthlight as Caleb eased the wagon to a stop. Hannah slid down to steady the girls. They pressed close to the hearth, where blankets warmed stiff limbs. Caleb and Amos flung burlap sacks against shutters, nails driven at an angle for wind's bite. The fire roared against stone, embers dancing like wild spirits. Outside, the dust storm pounded logs in relentless cadence. Hannah removed her shawl and draped it across two chairs, restoring its shape, weaving warmth into each fold. She pressed a finger to her locket shell, hearing her father's voice in every carved line. She traced initials on the hairpin, reminder of stolen inheritance and community reclaimed. Caleb leaned into the fire's glow, eyes moist with relief and gratitude. He met Hannah's gaze. "We did it," he whispered. She nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. He offered her a corner of the shawl. She tucked it around his shoulders. Their silence spoke of shared vows deeper than any spoken promise. Just as the storm's fury eased, Amos thrust a telegram across the table. Stamp of Cheyenne Circuit Court sealing its edges. Caleb slit the seal with his knife. Hannah unfolded the note, hand shaking. Ezra Kane script under cross-printed lines. Final appeal by Cheyenne. Court sits in 2 days. Your presence required. Caleb's breath caught. Lila peered over his arm, concern darkening her small face. Rose clutched her doll. Hannah folded the telegram, resolve hardening in her gaze. "One last trial," she said, a vow catching in her chest. Amos exhaled, lantern flame flickering on his steel gaze. "Then we ride to Cheyenne," he said. Outside, the last dust plumes wreathed the cabin like ghosts retreating. Pines cracked in dawn's first wind. Caleb guided his family close. Faith stitched in each step toward the door. In Elk Ridge's hush, they braced for final reckoning. Justice's echo waiting at Cheyenne's threshold. The valley held its breath, promise and peril entwined beneath Wyoming's boundless sky. Cheyenne's courthouse loomed under Wyoming's snow-dusted sky. 1876, its limestone facade scarred by wind and time. A thin crust of white glazed each cornice. Lanterns glowed like watchful stars through high windows. Inside, benches of oak creaked beneath winter's hush as Hannah Tate and Caleb Ward entered with Lila and Rose at their side. Amos Reed rode up behind them, his rifle slung across a wool-dusted coat. Each step across flagstones carried the weight of their journey, and the promise that Ezra Kane's final claim would meet Justice's unyielding gaze. The journey from Elk Ridge had been slow and cautious. Early snow drifted across rutted trails, turning each wagon wheel into a churned rut of frozen mud. Horses stamped beneath oilcloth covers. Caleb guided the wagon through pines frosted like sugar, his eyes sharp for hidden hollows. Hannah sat wrapped in her shawl-turned veil, its twilight hues now edged with silver frost. Lila and Rose huddled together, knees tucked beneath blankets, their doll and hairpin nestled safe in Hannah's pocket. Amos creaked atop his buckboard, cane tapping the frozen tongue of earth. Each mile toward Cheyenne was a prayer for vindication, and for the life they would build beyond fear. Inside the courthouse, Magistrate Caldwell presided beneath a banner of state seal and broken winter light. Ezra Kane sat to one side, coat dusted with snow, ledger and forged deeds piled before him. He met Hannah's gaze, lips thin with failing resolve. Sheriff Leary stood behind Hannah, star pinned to his chest, eyes tempered by the understanding that law must bend toward truth. Caleb's colt rested on the bench at his side, a silent sentinel against injustice. Amos stepped forward and laid out the evidence. The ledger's torn pages, Silas Boone's notarized confession carried in his trapper's journal, and Amos's own witness affidavit sealed in Elk Ridge's court. Each document he placed on the desk was a stepping stone across the chasm of Ezra's lies. Magistrate Caldwell studied each leaf, gavel poised above inked ledger. Hannah rose, locket in hand, and opened its silver shell, revealing Jacob Tate's deed fragment. She traced the boundary's lines with trembling finger, then produced the oak hairpin stamped with her mother's initials. With steady voice, she recounted her father's land grant, her mother's teachings under pine-scented air, and Ezra's betrayal of both. The bench room held its breath. Ezra's mouth opened, closed, words lost in his own shame. Lila reached for Hannah's hand. Rose pressed the hairpins 10 times to her cheek. Sheriff Leary stepped from the ranks. "Her land is hers," he said, voice carrying like church bell. "I carried her from that iron cage and watched her bind wounds and mend spirits. No law should bind her blood to greed." His star caught the morning light, and townsfolk stirred, miners, merchants, ranch hands, voices low but unwavering. Caldwell rapped his gavel. "Ezra Kane, your claim is void. The true deed stands. You are ordered to surrender any rights and depart the territory at once." He sealed the decree with a flourish. Ezra rose, ledger clenched like a confession, then nodded, a final bow to justice's triumph. Outside, snow fell soft as mercy, blanketing Cheyenne in the hush of rebirth. Afterward, Hannah and Caleb slipped from courthouse steps to the square's edge. Lila and Rose peeked from behind Hannah's skirt, eyes bright with wonder. Caleb draped the shawl across their shoulders, now a veil of victory and unity, folding its wool warmth around each of them. Hannah pressed a hairpin into Caleb's palm. He placed it over the deed's official seal. No words passed between them. The shawl and hairpin spoke of bonds strengthened by trial. Lila placed her doll in Caleb's boots. Rose tucked the hairpin into her bonnet. marking not just inheritance but hope. Their wedding was quiet and tender. Magistrate Caldwell administered vows in a small parlor warmed by pine logs and pine-scented air. Hannah wore the shawl as veil. Caleb held her hands, fingers wrapped in spurs' weight. Lila and Rose stood as witnesses, their whispering laughter like grace notes in a hymn. Amos served as best man. Cain tapped in approval. Snow drifted beyond curtained windows as they pledged their lives, each vow a promise carved in timber and trust. Spring's melt brought rushing creeks and emerald sagebrush to Elk Ridge. The family returned by wagon, the hairpin fastened to the lead mare's bridle as both marker and talisman. Amos trailed behind, supplies in the trapper's buckboard and mailbag ringing with letters of congratulations from Bitter Springs. At home, the cabin's yard blossomed with wild onions and columbine. Caleb guided the wagon near a newly built corral. Hannah greeted neighbors who brought plowshare and fence rails, each gift a stone in the ranch's rising prosperity. They faced drought's threat that summer. Heat shimmered across plains, grasses crisp to parchment. Caleb and Amos dug a new irrigation ditch from Sage Creek, each shovel load a sacrament of survival. Hannah tended seedlings, carrots, turnips, and her mother's heirloom beans, bed by bed. Lila and Rose filled water buckets for the mare and piglets, their small hands steady by Hannah's side. The hairpin marked the garden's furrow. The shawl's fringe shaded tender sprouts from noon's glare. Evening found them resting on crate benches, watching creeks glint in dying light. Trust had grown from seed to harvest. Years later, Elk Ridge's valley lay quilted in wheat and sunflowers. Hannah and Caleb's twins, blonde curls and dark eyes, ran between fence posts, laughter weaving through cottonwood boughs. The barn's loft housed winter's fodder. A new bunkhouse stood for Amos Reed, who had settled near the creek's bend with a small garden of his own. Sheriff Leary rode through for visits, hat tipped in friendship. He marveled at the children's antics, each echo of warmth and life a testament to Hannah's freedom. On one autumn eve, the family gathered by the hearthlit barn. Lila knelt to brush snow from a hairpin framed above the mantel. Rose draped the shawl across her mother's shoulders. Hannah pressed her hand to the hairpin's initials, letters like First Light. Caleb stood behind her, hands resting on her shoulders. Firelight danced on panelwood, and Amos lifted his cup of steaming chicory coffee in salute. Caleb raised his own cup. To Hannah Tate, the heart of Elk Ridge. Hannah tipped her head. To Caleb Ward, our home steadfast heart. Children's voices chimed in, names echoing like prayers. To home, to family. The barn's rafters held their laughter in safe embrace. Outside, winter's first snow drifted upon the sagebrush plains, each flake a benediction. In the hush of Wyoming's vast sky, freedom found its final claim, a woman's inheritance restored, a father's promise kept, and a family's love forged in shadow and light, woven into the land that would cradle them for generations to come.